User input. In this video, we will learn the basics of writing a program that responds to you. What is user input? User input is information given to a program by a user. The oldest, most classic form of user input is the keyboard. Whenever you press a button, either something happens or a certain character appears on the screen. In 2023, we have many other forms of user input. We have buttons, mouse clicking, double clicking, mouse hovering, face ID, thumbprint, etc., etc. There are many ways that we as users can communicate and send information to a program. However, in this course, we're just going to focus on one way, the keyboard way. More specifically, in this course, we're going to write programs that asks the user a question, then waits for the user to respond before proceeding. We will do this using the input method, which we will learn about in this video. So, there are 3 steps to basic user input. The first step, ask the user a question, then wait for the user to type a response and press enter, then store the user's response inside of a variable. So, for example, let's say I want to write a program that asks the user for its name. This line would be the code to do that. Now, let's break down this line piece by piece, starting with the word name. Name is the variable where the user's response will get stored. That is then followed by, of course, the assignment operator, which we discussed in a previous video. Then we have the input method. Okay? The input method will ask the user a question, then wait for the user to press enter. The Python interpreter will not move on to the next statement until the user presses enter. Okay? Now, what question will the input method ask? Whatever you type inside of the parentheses. In this case, we have a string and it says, what is your name? So, when I execute this line of code, what is your name gets printed to the output console. Then the Python interpreter pauses. It pauses and waits for the user to type something and press enter. So let's say, for example, I type Jason, then press enter. The word or the name Jason will get stored inside the name variable. Then let's say I add a second line that says print the variable name. The print method will print whatever value is stored inside the name variable, which in this case is Jason. I can also print this variable as part of a sentence. I can do so by combining it with the string containing the word hello in a space and the plus operator. Okay? This will then combine hello with Jason. This form of string combination is called concatenation, and we will explore that topic in more depth in future videos. It's also worth noting that when I print out the type of the name variable, I get str, which is short for string. In general, anytime you use the input method, any value returned by the input method will be interpreted as a string, even if you type a number. If you type a number, it don't matter, the input method will put it inside a string. This is important to know because, remember, there are some operations you can do with a string that you cannot do with an integer. Okay? For example, let's say I write a program asking the user, what's your age? And then upon receiving that answer, I want to then add 10 to that age and print it out. Well, let's execute it and see what happens. Okay? All right, the input method asks, what's your age? I type 15. 15 then gets stored inside the age variable. The Python interpreter then moves on to the second line, but rather than execute it, it instead prints out a long, nasty error message, which in summary is basically telling me that I cannot add a string to an int. Age being the string, 10 being the int. Python does not allow that form of addition. I can add 2 strings together, I can add 2 integers together, but I cannot add a string to an integer. Python will not allow it. So I have 2 options. I can either convert 10 to a string to make it a string addition statement, or I can convert age to an int. Let's see what happens when I convert 10 to a string. And I do that by simply placing quotation marks around the 10. Now I have 2 strings. Let's execute. The input method prints out, what's your age? I type 15. The Python interpreter then moves on to the second line, executes it, outputs 1510. In other words, it combined the 15 with the 10. it did concatenation. And this would be totally fine if this were my intention when I wrote the program. There are certain situations where you may write a program where concatenation is what you want. But concatenation is not what I wanted in this case. I wanted mathematical addition. But mathematical addition does not happen when you're adding two strings. It happens when you're adding two integers or two floats. This is why type matters. So if mathematical addition is what I want, I need two integers. So rather than convert 10 to a string, I need to convert age to an int. And there are two ways to do that. Here's the first way. By placing the input method inside the int method. When I do this, whatever value gets produced by the input method will then get converted to an int. Then when I move to the second line and I attempt to add age plus 10, the Python interpreter will recognize two integers and thus will perform mathematical addition. So I execute, what's your age? The user types 15. We move on to line 2, 15 plus 10, two integers, we get 25 as our output. The other way to do this, and arguably the easier way and more recommended way, retrieve the age the way we did it before by simply using the input method, which will store the age as a string, like we discussed. Then in line 2, convert the string to an int, once again using the int method. Then when we attempt to print out age plus 10, the Python interpreter will recognize two integers and will thus perform mathematical addition. So when we execute, what's your age? The user types 15. 15 gets converted to an int in line 2. We print out 15 plus 10, we get 25 as our output. It's also worth noting that Python provides a float method for converting variables to float type whenever we want to work with a float type variable. In any case, when using the int method on input, you must know that the user must only enter an integer value, otherwise an error message will get printed. So for example, if I use the int method on the input, but for my input I type ABC, 1, 2, 3, the Python interpreter will recognize non-integer, a non-number, and will flag an error message. Similarly with floats, if I'm going to use the float method on input, then the user must only enter a float value. It cannot enter a letter, a punctuation, symbol, or anything like that. Only a float value. If I don't, then the Python interpreter will raise an error message.